Hello, this is John Willis. So we're going to cover a topic called automated governance, and it'll be an overview. So I work for Red Hat. About 6 months ago, I joined up a team called the Global Transformation Office with Andrew Clay Schaefer there. He's the guy on the left, and then Kevin Bear, and then that's me, sort of going towards the right, the short guy, and then Jay Bloom. We're trying to figure out the next 10 years in terms of what sort of transformation should look like. We've written a number of books. I've written the DevOps Handbook, Beyond the Phoenix Project. Kevin was the co-author of the Phoenix Project. Andrew was one of the authors of Web Operations and did some work on the site reliability. So as Andrew likes to say, we wrote some books. So that's enough of my intro. So I wanted to talk about this idea of automated governance and how I got involved in this, and it's really a number of things, but I think I'll start off with the place where I was able at least to galvanize this idea into a paper, and then I've done some further papers here. But Gene Kim, part of IT Revolution, the author of the Phoenix Project, invites about 40 of us to Portland every year. And we've been doing this for 7 years, and we work on these papers. They become forum papers, little ebooks, and I've been doing it. I think 2014 was the first year, so I've done it every year. Overall, I counted, including this year, we just finished up about 4 or 5 books that will be coming out this summer. I think it'll be 30 books over 7 years, and so I've been involved. Some of them I've chaired the projects, some I've worked on. Many years I was just a floater on many of the books, so some years I just like to kind of go back and forth between the different projects. But the reason I'm pointing this out is that starting back in 2015, there was a working group that I worked with indirectly on this ebook, and all these are Creative Commons. You can download any of these from IT Revolution forum papers. It was called An Unlikely Union, DevOps and Audit. And so that was, at least from the sort of DevOps IT Revolution perspective, the first conversation about how audit and what we do with DevOps should have a tighter conversation. Segregation of duties, those type of things to sort of prove out. And we talked about this in the DevOps Handbook too. We talked about how certain ways of patterns, if you could use DevOps to deliver software, could actually apply to some of the compliance requirements, PSI, DSS, others. And then in 2018, this was a great paper. I didn't write this, but I was sort of an advisor and was worked around it. It was called Dear Auditor, and it was great. It was really an apology letter to auditors. Like, hey, we're really sorry. We should have done this. We should have talked to you about this. And it's not only the apology letter, but then it has a whole checklist of things that would sort of we promised to do. And there's actually, if you Google Dear Auditor, is actually a GitHub project on this, and this was really good. And the thread was about audit and DevOps. And a couple of years ago, I started getting this idea about how could we do a better job from the pipeline perspective of audit. And so last year in 2019, actually, usually these forums start in about April, and we usually wind up publishing the work sometime around the fourth quarter, or the end of third quarter, fourth quarter. And so I got a team together to really focus in on what we call DevOps automated governance, and it's a reference architecture. And I'll explain that in a little more detail. And so a couple of things the prior year or prior 2 years had gotten me really interested in this. Capital One has been heavily involved in these forum papers for years, and over the years we've had these discussions about pipelines, gating in the pipeline. And in 2017, Capital One wrote a really interesting paper on how they did, focusing on DevOps pipelines. And there was a subsection in there calling creating better pipelines. And what they talked about is this idea of these gates. They call them 16 gates. And these are things that allowed service teams to sort of bypass centralized authority, like cabs. In other words, they can get sort of auto deploy allowance if they could evidence these things, like that it indeed came from source control. It had optimum branching strategy, static analysis, all these things. I think I saw a presentation on last year. They say they're up to like 30 now. But in conversations about this, it was great to have these gates. But since you have these gates anyway, couldn't we turn these gates into evidence? So over a year or so, we kept having this conversation, and that sort of started me thinking about this. And then around that same time as that article, Google announced an open source project called Grapheus, and it turns out this was a project that they had actually been using internal for audit and governance. And it had a lot of features, and I think a lot of features that haven't really been utilized. But one in particular was an attestation, metadata attestation store. So attestations being evidence. And I started thinking, and actually Kit Merker, a good friend of the Frogs, worked for Frogs, had approached me about, why aren't you thinking about using Grapheus? And we had a great conversation. So that all led me up to sort of last year, trying to get a group of people together, say, hey, could we actually create a reference architecture around this automated governance idea? These terms are very overloaded, but we had a specific charter that we wanted to accomplish in this particular. And so we actually published, this is out, it's Creative Commons. It was, as you saw earlier, it was published in last year in September. And actually it was Mike Nygaard from Sabre. You might know Mike Nygaard from Release It, the inventor of circuit breaker patterns, Topo Powell over at Capital One, Steve McGill, Sam Guckenheimer, who's been heavily involved in most of Microsoft's infrastructure, myself, John Rezatowski at PNC, Dwayne Holmes, who runs large Kubernetes infrastructure at Marriott, and Courtney Kisser over at Nike. So we all got together for a couple of days, and we sort of tried to hash out, could we actually put this to paper in terms of reference architecture? Like, could the end model be a microservice Java in a container that gets a go, no-go into Kubernetes using Grapheus and actually Kritis, which goes along with that. And so one of my goals coming into this was changing the sort of language of how evidence is created for auditors. Typically auditors come into a site and they spend somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 days working with the organization, looking at changes. And what they really do is the evidence is actually subjective. So evidence and attestation, as far as this conversation, means the same thing. So the idea of changing subjective evidence or subjective attestations into objective evidence or objective attestations. So currently people create change records in most large enterprises, and then it's a human discussion about, like, Sue is going to do these things, Bob will read these things, maybe Sally wants Sue to add a couple of more lines, and these are all complex systems. So it's usually a human telephone game trying to describe the complexity of change. And then an auditor comes in and sees this record that is this discussion of using this subjective discussion as the evidence, and then tries to make sense of this. And it's a lot of toil, it's a lot of disconnectedness, and it just doesn't have high efficacy. And so could we actually change that to actually making this evidence as built-in automation, non-human intervention, automated and built into the pipeline itself in a digitally signed mechanism. So a set of signatures that basically become one immutable linked list of signatures. And so when we sat down and we thought about writing this thing, it was really threefold, the objectives. One was shorten audit time. Could we turn 30-day audits into half-day audits? Right? If the idea that instead of these subjective discussions and comparing screen prints, could we actually just show an immutable list? You don't really want to call it blockchain, but it's sort of based on a blockchain model. But could you just show sort of a immutable list of evidence of a change that no human had actually, there was no human intervention. And so you just look at these immutable lists and next. The second was, could we increase the efficacy? I mean, the truth of the matter is, I spent a lot of time with CIOs and then interviewing a lot of people in an organization over the last 3 or 4 years. And most of the audits they have, I call it security and compliance theater. And that's not even included when you get into modernization of cloud native and microservices. It's even way worse then. So the risk profiles that they sort of think they need attestations and this sort of rapid deployment structure, it's just completely disconnected. So what you find is in most organizations, the efficacy of an audit is extremely low. So could we increase the efficacy of an audit from like 20% to high 90%? And then last but not least, if we can do this, we can make a malleable argument of moving away from a change of advisory board or CAB or centralized authority. You know, if you think about the original Capital One article. And so what we did is we sat down, and I won't go into all this in gory details because it's in the reference architecture. I just want to expose you ideas. If you're interested, go, you can download the Creative Commons copy of it. It's on itrevolution.com. And so we broke this out into 7 stages. And the idea was to not really focus on how people perceive the pipeline, but to create boundaries for attestations. Remember, every time I say attestation, I mean evidence. So what were the logical blockings or boundaries for attestation? So we came up development, build, package as its own stage, non-prod, prod. And the reason we put dependency and artifact, it's in the sort of life cycle of the traditional CI/CD path, but the dependency manager and artifact have their own life cycles, sort of asynchronous to that. So we wanted to make sure that was understood. And then we created what we call common controls and common actors. And the controls were basically attestations. So if you remember what I said earlier, it was Nike, Capital One, PNC, Marriott, and Sabre Group. When it was all said and done, we had about 75 attestations. Now, I don't think one company or one organization or one service would use all of these, but it was a reference arc to just show what could be accomplished. So you can look, and again, I'm not going to go through, but if you take the source code stage, things like appearing on a pull request or unit test coverage, clean dependency, scanning. If you get to the build stage, unit testing, linting, immutability from the input-output perspective. And again, I'm going fast on purpose because if you're interested, all this is in, every one of these is actually spelled out. There's like a 2-page, 3-page on every one of the control points in the aggregate. Dependency management, license checking, approved external sources, security check, aging. So not allowing stale artifacts, approved versions, package, things like notary or signing of a signature, or if you're going to apply metadata from like a Zookeeper or something at operation time to make sure that the metadata can't be hacked or it can't man in the middle. So again, a lot more here. Like I said, 75 artifact stage, retention period, immutable artifacts, product stage. And then if you look at prod, then these, or prod and non-prod, there's a couple of subtle differences, but allowing configuration, like, so when you're dealing with like Kubernetes and containers, there's a lot of opportunities for adversaries or created adversaries by misconfiguration definitions. So making sure that you're capturing those type of things as artifacts for evidence. And then what we tried to do is then go through and identify, as an example, not a recommendation, just an example of where would be the control points, where would they come from? Things like SonarQube or check marks, and then of course JFrog X-Ray. But again, none of these were really recommendations. It was really just it was a sense-making exercise for us to say, does this make sense? And then could we go through a quick list of where all these attestations might come from? And as the project went, we didn't get through all of the things we wanted to accomplish. We finally end up with sort of reference architecture for a backbound architecture with Grapheus and Kubernetes, and we wanted to do this simple Kritis, which is in the admin controller. It was really a very simple implementation. But what got really interesting is when we were having these conversations, when we were writing the paper, at night we'd go to dinner, and all the people working all the papers would sort of hang out, and we started thinking about, like, if you could create this DevOps automated governance architecture, then could we start thinking about templates? So advisable templates for these things. And if you could do that, could you actually create human readable code to apply those templates to and so it was really sort of just a dinner conversation. But one of the banks went out and went full into this. They put a bunch of resources into it, what we are calling now policy as code. So we're actually going to this summer start a second version of this document where we're going to really focus in on policy. But I'm going to show you some of the stuff that as an advisor, but one of the banks that have really taken this to a whole new level, sort of post the reference architecture. And so here's some of the sort of principles for governance, human readable, platform agnostic, durable. And again, I'll let you read this with the slides, conditional parameters. But here's the thing. So what this one company did is went in and created this what they call PAC files, policy as code files. And here's the interesting thing. These are human readable files that the policy people now are engaged. So the actual policy people. So what happens now, service owners that want to go through this sort of newly defined way of processing stuff, and there's a lot of advantages, so people want to do this. They have to go to the policy people, and this was built by design with the policy people, and that they will actually come up with a human readable PAC file definition that will be associated with that service. And then, so the things we talked about, attestations, will actually be defined. Like, so if you look at pipeline versioning, that every application or service has to have a mnemonic for the actual component, has to have the mnemonic for the service, a component ID, and a version. And then you can look like later down as unit test coverage, and then you have a pull request review. So these things would actually get written in collaboration with the service owners, with the actual policy people. And by the way, now the policy people come to design and requirements. And these become immutable because they get actually stored in source control along with the artifacts that are going to deliver the service. So no, there's not, so it's, and then you have the DevOps automated governance architecture. Well, I'll show you how it's been advanced here in a minute. So what happens is every time you do a sort of a merge, you're going to pull in all the evidence of the commit. You're going to pull in the at that time PAC file with all the other artifacts, and that's going to be the immutable evidence that will end up, in this case, in Graphius in an attestation store. So now you've got the best of both worlds. You don't have policy people trying to give spreadsheets to infrastructure people or service people, and the service people having to interpret those spreadsheets into things that will wind up being maybe gated, very little of it evidenced. Now you have everything. You have the gating and the evidence all built in one. And this is where it gets really cool. I'll show you the architecture this one bank's using. So they're actually using now OPA and Rego. And so if you remember in that PAC file, there was a versioning pipeline, right? So that all services had to have mnemonic, component, and version. So basically what you would think now is sort of interface definitions would be the PAC files, would be the collaboration between the risk people and the service owners. And then the implementation could be something like Rego. So here's an example of actually using the PAC file and Rego to control in Kubernetes whether something is allowed from a policy perspective. This gets really, really cool. I mean, we're even talking about in this next version of, if you have all this, you could do policy error budgeting, right? So here's a sort of a sample architecture. It's a little more complicated than this, but we put Kafka on both ends. Actually, right now we're working with trying to figure out if we could put in, I'm in an advisor mode, but if we could put in, a serverless architecture in between, because when you get to some level of volume, then like Kafka, serverless implementation, like Knative, and then Kafka, and then to this enforcer evidence engine, and the enforcer can integrate with OPA. So it's just really, really cool. We're trying, hopefully in the next reference architecture definition, we'll get to open source some of this stuff. But either way, we'll have a pretty robust reference architecture, how this works. And the other thing that's really cool about this, one of the problems you have in most enterprises today is that, in my experience, very few enterprises, one of the problems, let me step back here. One of the problems that you have with sort of audit in the enterprise is it's based on most of the audits are based on a traditional service management model where every change has to be associated with a service owner, and service owners traditionally are associated with a CMDB CI configuration item. Well, I can't tell you that I visited in the last 3 or 4 years any large institution that told me honestly that the CMDB was more accurate than basically 25%. So if the whole model of your evidence in an audit is based on this sort of false idea and not based on what's happening in like GitHub across to sort of a Jenkins or a build model, like the beauty of this model is that you have to, in order to play, you have to actually define a config. So you really start creating an emergent configuration management database because you have to find a mnemonic component and version. And by definition, all services that are sort of building and gaining more value in this process are actually becoming the emergency NDB. Not only that, you have this continuous audit replay. You can look at, because remember, he said earlier, those artifacts are immutable in the fact that you know exactly what version of a PAC file got pushed. And in fact, actually, the Rego file as well got pushed at that time. So you can always go back and sort of replay. And the other thing, man, we talked about error budgeting. So now you can actually sort of analyze the sort of the continuous evidence or continuous compliance, if you want, or we've been calling automated governance, are the things that fail, right? And so one more subject I want to talk about is that paper came out. It was I've been talking about it for about a year or so, and then there's a group out in New York. It's called the Open Network User Group, run by a guy named Nick Lippis, and their board members are like the largest banks in New York and really in the world. And one of their focus over the years has been software-defined networking, SD-WAN. They've been moving more into DevOps, and some of the board members had saw this paper that we did, and Nick Lippis knew me, so he reached out to me and asked me if I would want to help drive a cloud automated governance based on that paper that we did. So we got together, and this time we created, and really this was really cool because the people that were involved in this one was FedEx, Kaiser Permanente, Cigna, and JP Morgan Chase, and I think JP Morgan Chase, and then indirectly Don Duet was the VP of Engineering for All Goldman. He's independent now, and we focused on the relationship of attestations from the cloud providers to the tenant. And I'm going to go through this really quick. Again, this is an Creative Commons book. That paper that's available from ONUG. It's pretty easy to find. You can download it. You do have to fill out some name and stuff like that, but it's a free book. This paper, it got a lot of, it was about a month ago now, and a little less than a month ago, the Wall Street Journal wrote an article about it where they interviewed it was actually sponsored by FedEx, Cigna, and Kaiser Permanente. So the three CISOs who sponsored this were interviewed by the Wall Street Journal, talking about the work we did in this paper. So really, really significant work. And I'll try to summarize it again. I'm not going to go into gory detail. Like I said, I'll leave you, the listener, the reader, if you're interested. Obviously, my contact information will be all over this presentation. If you want to talk about it, anybody who knows me, I love talking about this stuff or exploring. But our goal in this paper was, we had 3 goals, and they were really focused on the cloud providers showing evidence back to the tenants or the consumers of those clouds. So one of the things that we wanted to make sure was, could we ask the community? So one thing I wanted to be clear too is, initially when we sat down, everybody said, you're crazy if you think you're going to get all 3 cloud providers or all 5 cloud providers or how many there are to actually take your advice. Even though we had about $25 billion in spend on that team, but I said from the get-go is, let's not worry about like trying to convince Amazon or Google or Microsoft. Like, that shouldn't be the focus of our paper. What our focus should be is convince another 100 on the companies that would represent $1 trillion in asset buying power. And if they all agreed with this paper, then maybe we'll. Well, by the way, we're doing a second version of this summer, and already 2 of the top 3 cloud providers are in. So mission accomplished. So here's the 3 things. One is, could we get in a unified format? So that means each cloud provider sort of agrees to create a normalized version of some type of signature that tells you that nothing's changed from the way they did sort of electricity to hypervisor. So it's a signature that tells you that the known state. They don't have to tell any of the IP, how they do it, any secret source. Just, let's keep real simple. I know it's not this simple, but imagine a checksum event that told you that the posture of anything that you're looking at hasn't changed. So at scale, a change to that boot sequence or boot infrastructure could actually create new opportunities for adversaries. Or, for example, the first principle of all incident review is go back to the last change. So imagine if we could keep normalized across all the providers an event that tells us every time we do a new deploy or once a day that nothing has changed in that sequence. Or something goes wrong, we can check to see if that sequence. So again, a lot more detail. The second point is, since all cloud providers see all ingress requests from a tenant, as consumer, right, all the API calls, could they actually expose that back to the tenant in some normalized format? And the reason why you'd want this is, today a lot of consumers of cloud will scrape logs. They do this so they'll scrape different logs for different providers. There's no normalized way even on the log structures, but let alone having to scrape logs and do sort of all things like that, which is brittle. The logs change. Could we just say, since you're seeing everything, could you just spit that back in an event gateway? Something that we could process through sort of Knative or some type of event gateway process, and that we could get firsthand look on what you see. And so for things like service request forgery or some runaway activities, or somebody's sort of not follow the rules and not put the right metadata, it would be much easier to have a single point of control to identify any sort of anomalous behavior that actually could get us in trouble. And last but not least is look for a normalized structure from a security framework. All the different products have security frameworks. They speak different languages, and they don't really talk to security professionals. So again, a little more of that in the paper. This is the model for normalization, just winding down here. But here, the last thing I did is, one of the things we tried to do is create a pseudocode based on Gherkin. If you remember, the other people was based on YAML. So I wanted to try to explore a different model, seeing if we could do something with Gherkin. So in here, I've got a couple of examples based on those two models. One is the boot integrity. So this is basically sort of a Gherkin model of checking to see if the sort of that event or that checksum boot sequence hash has changed. And then this is one where if we were seeing all the ingress traffic to a provider and we were to listen on it, we could look for metadata that should have been there. And if it's not, then we can go looking for sort of nefarious actors like a crypto miner and things like that. And I just wanted to end up with, as always, one of the, I talked about Kit Merker. I talked about, JFrog. I really do love the JFrog family. I've, they invite me to speak. I guess that's why I like them. I guess they like me. But this book, there's just a lot of this book, the Liquid Software, which talked about a lot of the principles in automated governance, in the sort of creating trust in the deployment pipeline. So that was another, I think I'm doing the right thing, a couple of years ago when I read this book, and it talked about Grapheus, and it just helped me to say, more than one person is telling me this is something that's needed, and it just everything fell in place. And so and it's just a fabulous book. And I always try to end these presentations saying it's a quick read. It really sets the mindset perfectly. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoy. And please, if anything of this interests you, I'm pretty easy to find. Reach out to me. I love to have discussions about this stuff.